What's
Bill,
that?
if you get up to move, they can see your shirt, but be sure you're wearing pants this time.
That would be good.
We
What
play
do we do?
pickleball. We play pickleball.
We
Oh,
did.
yes. How'd it
Lisa
go?
And Bill and Corbin and I.
Awesome. How'd it go?
It was not that hard. You tell how out of
Okay.
shape you are, though. I'll tell you that.
Are you sore?
Not sore, just breathing hard after. It's
Yeah.
much easier than tennis, I think. Well, welcome to our Atheist and Christian Book Club, a monthly get-together of believers and non-believers, skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives, alternating between atheist and Christian books each month. We've been doing this for about 7 years. My name is James Walker. I'm president of Watchman Fellowship, a Christian evangelical apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. I'm very excited about our guest author. Usually we do have the author of the book in question in the room, Zoom room with us to discuss his or her book. And we do have that this time. I'm excited. But before I get to that, very quickly, I do want to take just a minute to talk about the next couple of months of what we're going to be doing at the Atheist and Christian Book Club. In April 10th, we're having a return author, John Loftus. John Loftus is a former Christian, now atheist, author of numerous books. We've looked at a couple of his books before. He's been in person at our offices in Arlington, Texas, for one of the clubs in the past. I think he's been a guest twice now over the years, but he'll be coming back in April to talk about his book, Debating Christianity. Basically, the main part of the book is a series of chapters which were introductions to debates that he had with William Lane Craig and other, I think Craig, David Wood, other Christian apologists. And we're going to do focus chapters. We're going to focus on the two chapters that he did involving David Wood on existence of God, and then on the problem of the evil are the two chapters that we're going to be looking at. Watch on our atheistchristianbookclub.com or at our Facebook page for more information on that. But we're excited to have John Loftus back with us. And then in May, we're going to be looking at, we're going to have having Robert Bowman. Dr. Bowman is written the book, The Incarnate Christ and His Critics. And that's going to be May 8th from 7 to 9 p.m. Via Zoom. Rob is a dear longtime friend of me. He was actually served on the staff of my ministry, our ministry, Watchman Fellowship, for many years. I'm excited to be looking at his book, and that's going to be in May. And then in June, we have lined up Larry Shapiro, and who is the author of The Miracle Myth. He's an atheist author. And Daniel, could you just tell us just a little bit more about Larry's book and the interview that you did?
Yeah, I just interviewed Larry today. He's debated John Lennox and Mike Licona. As far as I know, we talked this morning. I did an exclusive interview for us, for our book club, kind of a summary of the book, a very respectful philosophical epistemic approach in terms of the resurrection and miracles. He does not go so far as to say miracles are impossible or the resurrection didn't happen. He's just looking at this more from an epistemic and philosophical position, and believes that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is not a justifiable kind of knowledge. And so it was a very polite chat, and enjoyed it. I think he'll be a great guest, very congenial, sharp. And so the interview that I did with him will be in lieu of the book for whatever reason, if you can't get the book, but the book is very small. It's like 160 pages. Came out 9 years ago, but I'll have the interview up on our Atheist and Christian Book Club web page or YouTube page in the coming weeks.
Yeah, we often try to have alternatives, either podcast or YouTube video for those that can't get access to the book or have time to read it. And we also have a lot of times we'll do focused chapters, so we can anything in the
James,
book's fair game. Yes.
I forgot to tell you, and we'll have this up on our Atheist Christian Book Club website. But we also have a podcast interview coming out in April with Rob about his new book.
Oh, okay.
So we'll have that out mid-April, and then we'll share the links on our book club webpage so you can listen to the podcast because the book is 800 some odd pages. But the podcast interview is concise, and Rob basically breaks down his thesis in about an hour. Of course, it's not the book, but if you can't get the book, the podcast will be out mid-April. Look on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com, for the links coming out in mid-April to that.
Well, we do, and we're open to suggestions, but for any of our members, we are looking for ways to get engaged with this content more. And I know some people aren't book readers, but these are two important of issues to ignore. So we want to find some ways to get engaged outside of the few minutes, the short time that we have each month at the club itself. So let me tell you about our current guest. I'm very excited to have Dr. Strauss with us, and I've known him way back. I met him probably 6 years ago or longer when he was on the campus of University of Texas in Dallas, UTD, and he was at the Reasonable Faith chapter. I don't know if you remember meeting me there, Michael, but this is where we first met, and then I've had the great joy of being teaching alongside of him at events in New Orleans at the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary at their annual Defend Apologetics Conference, and got to spend some time with him there as well. Dr. Strauss, Michael Strauss, received his undergraduate degree in physical science from Biola and his master's and PhD in experimental particle physics from the University of California, Los Angeles. He teaches at the University of Oklahoma as the David Ross Boyd Professor of High Energy Particle Physics, and spends part of his year researching at the CERN laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland, analyzing data from the Atlas detector using the Large Hadron Collider. Dr. Strauss is a Christian, and we're going to be talking about his 2019 book, The Creator Revealed: A Physicist Examines the Big Bang and the Bible. So let me just say welcome, and thank you for joining in with the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I think it's so important just to have dialogue with people who either agree or disagree with you. I often tell people that, in my closet here in my office, this is the only room in the house I get. My wife gets all the other rooms, but in my office here in the closet, I have a bunch of books, and probably as many by atheists or half as many by atheists as I do by people I agree with. So this is how I try to pursue truth, is looking at all options and discussing them. So I think this is a great forum. I wish there was more forums like this. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks you so much. And this is a long time coming, and it slipped my mind because I talked to you about doing this a couple of years ago, and then I completely forgot to follow up on that. So I'm so excited that you could be part of this now. And I'm trying to remember, Mike, were you there when Bill Cluck and I did the little dialogue back and forth, Atheist and Christian, in the chapel there? Were you there for that? Okay. Yep. Well, you already know Bill, and Bill wasn't there this year at Defend in New Orleans, but he has been there several times, I believe. And Bill is the co-founder. He's the kind of the atheist.
Yeah, and he's already reaching out to me with
exactly. You'd see it.
Yeah, he's trying to fit in, anything to fit in, right?
I'm as James read in my bio, I'm originally from California, so I'm a transplanted Sooner, but I've been here 30 years now.
We had to adapt.
Well, Bill has been going through, I don't know if you followed this part of his story, but in the last year or so, Bill has been going through, and it's public, it's not private information, but he's been going through somewhat of a maybe a crisis of faith, or maybe better to say a crisis of non-faith, in that he read this Luke Barnes book. That was one of our book club books, Luke Barnes' book on fine tuning. And man, it's really affected him, and he's spent a long time talking with Luke in by Zoom in Australia, and plus in the book club and things like that. But he was excited too to be able to get you on the club and talk with you as well. So, Bill, I wanted to give you a chance for the first volley of questions, or a couple of questions maybe for Dr. Strauss. Bill?
Yeah, well, don't forget, I want to ask him about the Pauli exclusion principle, but in the strong nuclear force. But first, you had an interview with Dan, and Dan asked you about the age of the Earth, and you said, "I'm in my 60s." So anyway, I met Josh McDowell years ago, and I said, "Josh, just give it to me straight. Are you old Earth or young Earth?" And you know what Josh said? "I'm 62." So kind of similar to what you said.
Yeah, I don't actually remember saying that. Maybe I misunderstood the question.
And I might have misinterpreted.
The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. That's unambiguous. Yeah.
Well, speaking of hermeneutics, I have a little bone to pick. Yeah, I met Hugh Ross. I used to be in his little things. You know, he has these things all over the place. So in his hermeneutic, he says that the earth was created the fourth day or later than the sun. The sun, as we know in science, was created, what, 500 million years after the Big Bang? Is that right?
No, about 9 billion years.
Yeah. So the earth was created
more or less the same time as the sun. The whole solar system forms 9 billion years after the Big Bang.
Okay.
They all form pretty much the same. Yeah, I've got my hair. I got it. I don't know what's going on there, but
that's great. But anyway, the thing is, Hugh Ross says that it appeared on the fourth day because he believes this. So why couldn't God have made that clear? Don't you think he's doing exegetical gymnastics to make scripture?
No. First of all, yeah, he's not. The Hebrew word is made appear, and I can show you Hebrew scholars that say that. And so no, there's not hermeneutic gymnastics there.
Okay.
The problem is we're reading a book that's written in English that's translated from ancient Hebrew. And ancient Hebrew has 3,000 root words and about 8,000 total words. And English has about 1 million words and 180,000 in a college dictionary. So most words in Hebrew have more meanings even than they would in English. But yeah, I can show you Hebrew scholars that say the same thing as Hugh Ross, that the words for day 4, that the sun, moon, stars appear, not that they were created that day.
But it's more than that. You have in Genesis, the third day, you have the flowering plants, the angiosperms coming on the third day. That is way too early. When I was, dealing with Hugh Ross's people, even his own staff said they disagreed with Hugh on this point, that the plants come too early on day 3. Not to mention, if you cram millions of years in there, you don't have the plants being pollinated. If the sun appears on the 4th day, you got a real problem.
No, okay, so that's not true. You know that plants can photosynthesize on a cloudy day. So it's no problem if the sun is out there giving light to the earth, that plants can photosynthesize.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's not an issue at all.
But you do see the criticism, the plants are coming too early on the third day.
So the problem again, so I'm trying to find a talk I give on this, and if so, I can then show you my interpretation. So my interpretation is very similar to Hugh Ross's, but let's go here. Do I have this? Yes. All right, good. So let's do this. All right.
It's funny, I used to go to the creation conferences like in Lynchburg, Virginia, Jerry Falwell's church, and they used to put, it was young earth conferences, and they used to put
Yeah.
his picture up like this is Satan. I mean, they just really don't like each other, the young, and Hugh Ross tried to reach out to the young earth people and they said, forget it. So,
All
Hey,
right. So
Mike,
here,
are you wanting to share screen?
yep.
Okay, guys, you might not have to make him like a co-moderator or something.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm on Zoom to Europe every day. I use it all the time, but yeah, sharing's not turned on. I can send a request.
I'm going
So,
to allow right now. There you go.
all right, so let me share this. All right, so here is my take on it. Okay, so here's the order of the events in Genesis, and the story is told from the perspective on the surface of the earth. So on the surface of the earth is formless. That means incapable of supporting life. Void, there's no life. It's watery. We know the early earth was all water, and it's dark on its surface. It's dark on the surface because interplanetary debris is still there from forming the solar system, and the atmosphere is really thick. So if the Bible had said in verse 2, the second verse, that it's dark everywhere, it'd be wrong, but it only says it's dark on the surface. Then as the atmosphere thins and interplanetary dust clears, and this is when it happened, 4.6 billion years ago. You can see now there's light hitting the earth. It's like a cloudy day. This happened 4.2 billion years ago. The water cycle begins, that's day 2, 3.8 billion years ago. Continents form 3 billion years ago. Now here's the one you're talking about. If it does say flowering plants, but the word that's used there can be anything that photosynthesize. So we say that this is the beginning of photosynthesis that eventually leads to flowering plants, then it fits in perfect. Then because you have this bacteria, they create oxygen, and oxygen clears up the atmosphere. So the atmosphere becomes transparent. That happened 2.4 billion years ago, just shortly after bacteria. Then fish and birds, this is when they came. And then this word that I agree with Hugh Ross, the word nephesh is technically soulish. It doesn't necessarily mean all life, though it can. So if you interpret that Hebrew word nephesh as higher mammalian life, then that happens 40 million years ago. And then on day 6, you get, again, nephesh animals, not all animals. And if you look at when modern mammals come, that's 10 million years ago, then humans, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapien, about 0.1 million years ago. So the only caveats to these is I have to interpret the plants as first photosynthesizing things, and I have to interpret this nephesh in one of its narrow meanings rather than its broad meaning. And those are not exegetical big leaps. Oops. So there's, I don't know what happened there.
there's our man.
Yeah, previous.
You touch on this in chapter 11, I think.
Yeah, but again, at that point, I hadn't really done the research to find exactly when it all happened, age-wise, and this has happened. I decided I really need to go back and make sure I can put dates by all these things, and so yes, if you take day 3 plants as meaning modern tree type plants, it's out of place. If you take it, and the Hebrew word can mean, algae. And so if you take it as that, it's fine. And same with the animals on day 6. If you take them as all animals, you're incorrect. If you take the Hebrew word nephesh, which literally means soulish, it's animals that, in fact, it even mentions cattle. Why would you mention cattle specifically if you're dealing with all land animals? They're dealing with the kind of land animals that interact with humans, which is why I write modern mammals is 10 million years ago. So anyway, with only those 2 caveats, 0.5 and 0.9, everything is exactly right. And those caveats are not a big blind leap of faith. They're completely consistent with what the Hebrew words mean.
But it gets worse. You're familiar with Pakicetus, right? That eventually evolved into the, whales, right? Modern whales. Pakicetus is a land animal. It evolved into duoderms, and so
Yeah, but again, it doesn't get worse because you're assuming that day 6 is talking about all land animals, and certainly there were land animals before point 8. But if day 6.9 is only talking about a subset of land animals, which I think the word means, then it's not a problem.
but the big problem is you have a couple, Adam and Eve, which
Okay, but you didn't bring that up. That's a whole nother question.
well, here's the question: is the Homo sapien population never got below 2,000?
That actually, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I
So
interrupted.
anyway, there was no original Adam and Eve. Populations evolved, not individuals. And your guy at Biola University, William Lane Craig, has said the first Adam and Eve was, you're familiar with this, was Heidelbergensis, and that's 700,000 years ago. So why not be like him and say, this is mytho-history, don't take it seriously? I mean, that's his view, right?
Yeah, so what I will say is what I want you to do tonight is I want you to go home and write a one-page account of the history of the development of the earth and life on earth that speaks to all people and all cultures and all languages and all times. And to do that is not an easy thing to do, but this passage does. And to do it, there is some ambiguity. So I think there are different possibilities. One possibility is, I wouldn't put it the same terminology as you, but one possibility is it's like a parable that Jesus tells. It's telling a truth, but in a parabolic form. That's not my favorite interpretation, but it's a possibility. And I think, these possibilities are out there. The one I just showed you, that it's actually correct history in the correct order, is my favorite possibility. And again, I put humans at 0.1 million years ago because the error bar on that is huge. We really don't exactly know when modern sapien came about. And we could talk about who Adam and Eve were. I think the most sticky points I have with a historical understanding of creation account is exactly who Adam and Eve were and when they lived. But there are lots of options. Are you familiar with Josh Swamindass's option?
Of course, he agreed. He's an old earther who says genetically,
But that puts them, that could put them 6 to 10,000 years ago and still be two literal people. And I think that's a possibility within the text. In fact, it solves certain problems. Why is Cain afraid of people? Who are the people? It's because Adam and Eve were a representative couple. So again, I have ideas about what I think are the best options for the text, but I'm not dogmatic because I think the text, because it's a one-page account of the history of the earth that speaks to all people in all times and all languages and all cultures, I think there's flexibility in what it might actually mean.
Yeah, there's obvious flexibility because they used to believe in the canopy theory, and even the young earthers don't believe in that anymore. So
really, I thought most young earthers still believe,
except for like a Ken Hovind or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, let me get to my problems as an atheist with just our worldview. You have the electromagnetic force, the gravitational force, and the strong nuclear force. So what's the chances that we could get this electromagnetic force just by chance, or the gravitational force for that matter?
Well, nobody knows where the forces came from. I mean, you're asking, as a physicist, you ask why. Well, why does the strong force work? Because gluons have color charge. Well, why do gluons have color charge? I mean, eventually you come to a point to say this is the limit of our knowledge, and whether or not there's a deeper why, an answer to a deeper why question is always an unknown problem till it's been solved. So I don't understand.
Nuclear force that holds the protons and neutrons together, and it gets stronger as they go out, right? Is that right?
Only up to about 10 to the minus 15th meters.
That's right.
The,
Anyway,
the analogy I give, it's like a rubber band. If two things at the end of a rubber band are really close, then the rubber band's unstretched and there's no force. As they get farther apart, the rubber band starts to stretch and the force gets stronger. But when they get too far apart, the rubber band breaks and there's no more force between them. That's a pretty good analogy of what the strong force is like.
Yeah, thanks for that. In the Pauli exclusionary principle, you have these electrons that fill certain energy levels. How does that come about by chance?
Well, again, no Christians think anything came about by chance. So
I'm just trying as an atheist to try to reconcile do you see where I'm going?
yeah, so we don't know the answer. Again, there's a gut feeling. That's a pun. If you know what a gut is, there's a gut feeling, brand unified theory that all the
I didn't know that.
yeah, that all the forces are a single force. We call it, if you combine the electroweak and the electromagnetic, the weak and the strong force together, that's a grand unified theory. And there's a gut feeling that that's the case, but we don't know for certain. We don't know.
Well, you got to
or what they are or anything.
Be careful not to stub your toe either. Right.
Yes, the theory of everything is when you add gravity, and that's
right.
TOE, right?
Right. So gravity, your toe. Yeah.
Yeah, I got it.
Carry on.
When James and I would give our talks, my problem or his problem was one of the best arguments for theism is the fine tuning. Like, why is it? How does the gravitational constant be so precise? The fine structure constant, if that's not right, if it's 4%, either way, we don't get oxygen, carbon, right? We don't even get off the ground.
No. And if the mass density was 1 part in 10 to the 60th difference at a millionth of a second after the Big Bang, we wouldn't be here. There's so many things. I'll tell you, again, I work with a bunch of people who are agnostic or atheists. The three answers to your question of fine tuning are: there's a tuner behind it all. We live in a multiverse, and this is a selection effect, and we're just lucky. This is the one out of a bazillion universes that can support life. Or there's something within, well, there's actually 4 answers. Or there's something within the laws of physics which force them to be what they are. But to me, that just pushes the problem back once. If the laws of physics are so well designed to give you the constants you need, where'd they come from? And Alexander Vilenkin says this in a famous quote. And then the other is Sean Carroll's answer. It's just brute fact, which to me might be true, but it's extremely unsatisfying.
Right. I'm just, it comes down to probability. It's like, what are the chances that you have all these constants, and like you said, the mass of the electron and the mass of the proton have to be just right? If you had to give me a number, 1 out of 1,000, what are the chances?
So I'll give you so Hugh Ross talks about the things that we know are needed to make a planet that can support higher life forms. And the chances are 1 in 10 to the 300 of just finding a single planet in the visible universe or something. I mean, the chances, it depends. Rees wrote a book called The 7 Constants of Nature, and he lists only 7 things that are finely tuned. You read the anthropic cosmological principle, and there are 100 things that are finely tuned. The chances are, like the number of possible universes in string theory, 1 in 10 to the 500 or something.
Okay, so you're saying there's a chance.
I'm
I don't have any
guessing.
more questions, James.
I'm guessing. Yeah.
So there's a chance. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's from Dumb and Dumber, so there's a chance.
I just need a chance.
Yes. On the fine tuning, basically when it comes, we've talked about it on the bigger scale, the expansion rate, if it's minutely off either direction, you don't get planets and stars, and you don't get really even the periodic table, apparently. Is that, do you concur on that, Mike?
Well, the periodic table comes from the dying stars, which has more to do with things like the strength of the strong force. But you don't get any, if you have too little matter, you don't get any coalescing of stars and galaxies. If you have too much, the universe collapses back in on itself. And I forget the exact time period, but on the order of a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang, if you had thrown in, 1 dime's worth of more material, you wouldn't have a universe for us now. So that's how
Hugh
fine.
Ross compares that to a fleck of paint on a battleship.
Yeah. Now,
by the way, we have Kelly here from her channel, Godless Granny, and she said, "Bill, are you doing this for views?" And I went, "I don't think so." So, did you have a question, Kelly?
One question I have is, I noticed in your list of what evolved when, dinosaurs were not there.
That's
And
right.
we know that birds evolved from dinosaurs, so they had to have come before the birds. But they're also large land animals, although they are not mammals. So where do you put the dinosaurs?
well, the dinosaurs, I put them. Oh, wait, did I share? No, I didn't share. I put dinosaurs 250 million to 65 million years ago. Just like,
Oh, okay. I missed that on the screen.
well, again, here's the thing. This is the key. On day 6, this Hebrew word nephesh is used. Nephesh, the translation of it is soulish. So when I think of a soulish animal, I think of a higher mammal, the kind of quadrupedal mammals we would domesticate or hunt, not reptiles. And now the Hebrew word nephesh can mean all life, but it can also mean these kind of animals that we interact with as humans. So again, that's the caveat with point 9. I'm interpreting that Hebrew word nephesh in one of its narrow meanings rather than its broad meaning. But for some reason, it isn't used earlier except when it's used of higher mammalian life forms. So it seems to be that the writer is using that word to refer only to animals that we would consider have a high level of intelligence, like dolphins and like horses or something, and dogs that we domesticate. And so therefore, other animals that walk on land are not mentioned, but they would be back here before, like you said, before fish and birds, but they're just not mentioned in my interpretation. So again, to be totally transparent, I am interpreting 2 Hebrew words in specific ways, which is within their realm of possibility, but not their only meanings. One of the words is the word for plants, which can mean anything that photosynthesize, and one is the word for nephesh animals, which can mean simply these higher mammals.
So you do believe that us and chimpanzees and lemurs had a common ancestors? You're familiar with the endogenous retroviruses, right?
Well, again, I'm not talking about how God made humans. That's the subject of evolution at this point. I'm simply talking about the order of the events in Genesis and how they line up.
Well, Genesis has man specially created where the evidence, the endogenous retroviruses, those endogenous.
Why do you say Genesis has man specially created?
Because it says Adam and Eve were created. It doesn't say they evolved from a common ancestor along with chimpanzees.
Well, again, it doesn't use the word create. There's a Hebrew word bara that is translated create. It doesn't use that word. It says they were made of the dust of the earth. That's the material. It's not the process. If I tell you my car is made of the iron ore of the earth, it tells you the material, not the process. It might have been made in a factory in China. It might have been made in my garage by hand. And so when it says man is made of the dust of the earth, it's telling you the material. There is very little that tells you the process, if anything. So I would argue that evolution is compatible with the story. I struggle with evolution as a scientist, not as a Christian, but that's another question there.
It's just endogenous retroviruses are the silver bullet because these viruses are on the same place in the genome with us, chimpanzees, and so forth.
Well, yeah, again, there are people who don't think that's a silver bullet, but I don't want to
Well,
argue.
yeah, Eric Coben, I just talked to him and he's going to do a video on that in 2 weeks.
So,
Well, and to your, similarity of correlation and phenotype does not mean causation that they originated from the same ancestor necessarily.
yeah.
I know you have the chapter in the appendices, I think, on the E word evolution, and do you you deal with that just lightly?
Well, I take a kind of an agnostic position. In physics, in particle physics, we only make a discovery if there's a 1 in 6 million chance we're wrong, a 5 sigma effect. And when I talk to, many Christians believe in evolution. They believe it's completely compatible with the Bible. And I agree with that. It is compatible. So my problems are scientific. And when I talk to even Christians who believe in evolution and I give them why I struggle with it, I'm agnostic about it in some sense. They say, well, your standards are too high. Your standard of proof is too high. And I say, fine, I'm a physicist. That is my standard of proof. I can't help it that geneticists and biologists have a lower standard of proof than what I need. So I just don't think the mechanism works. I don't think natural selection or random mutation has the creative power that's attributed to it. So I think, in fact, the mantra that evolution works with the current mechanisms is hindering biological research. If the biologists would admit that the mechanisms don't work, they'd go find the real mechanism that causes evolution to work. That's my kind of gut feeling about it.
I'd be curious to know, you personally, do you think Adam was born of a woman, or was he created ex nihilo, or not nihilo, but from dust?
Right. Well, the material's dust, that's clear. The process I'm ambiguous on. I think I need more information to so I have 3 categories. Actually, let me bring up, this talk was to a bunch of Christians who don't believe in an old universe, which is kind of who the book was originally written to. The original title of this book, as I was writing it, was Why Christians Should Believe in the Big Bang. And it turned out to be somewhat different. But so here I have these 3 columns. Is God the creator? Did the Big Bang occur? And did evolution occur? And, this is the young earth creationist, the old earth creationist, and the evolutionary creationist. All these believe God did it. The process is just different. And I could fall in either of these 2 categories, old earth or evolutionary, depending on the evidence. Right now, I struggle with the evidence for evolution, including the mechanisms that to me don't work and the level of proof that I need as a physicist. So I call myself an old earth creationist. I kind of believe that evolutionary creation is correct, that God did use evolution, but I'm not going to, fall into this category till you can give me a mechanism that I think has the power that's attributed to it. Again, that's my opinion as a physicist. And most Christians who work in genetics or biology are evolutionary creationists.
In past book clubs, Mike, we did a book club on Francis Collins' book. So you have a Christian who's
I've read his book,
in evolution.
Yeah.
But then we also did a book, and remind me who that was, guys. I can't remember. It's the Atheist who does not believe in evolution.
Yeah. Again.
Who was that? You remember from Discovery Institute, I think?
I don't know if he was
Berlinski.
Berlinski, David Berlinski.
Yeah, Berlinski. Yeah.
And there are atheists who believe evolution is correct, but also would agree with me that we haven't found a mechanism that really works yet. I think Shapiro would fall into that category probably. And so, this isn't a radical idea. It's radical within the scientific community in general, because most people accept the current theory of evolution, including the mechanisms. But I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist, and my standard of proof is higher. And in physics, we don't say we've discovered something till we know the mechanism. And I just don't think the mechanisms work. So again, my gut feeling is that evolution probably is true, but I'm not going to, fall into that category of calling myself an evolutionary creationist till you've convinced me that the mechanisms work.
I was
Well,
at Discover Institute seminar. It was a day-long event in Denton here last month. It was put on by Discovery Institute. Steve Meyer was there. He gave a presentation, and I've heard him do this before, where he was talking about in biology the developmental gene regulatory network, and this one is common. You can put it up on you can Google it. I interviewed Paul Nelson, who is the biologist who got Steve interested in biology to do Signature in the Cell. And I interviewed Paul at the conference, but Paul was talking about the sort of the closed structure of what a gene regulatory network is. And he said, you can't tinker with this and expect that you're going to get a novel body plan. He said, when you tinker with the developmental gene regulatory network within the network itself, you just get failed developments. And but I wish I could explain the details, but he listed on the screen for the presentation the developmental gene regulatory network for a purple sea urchin, and you can Google that and see the picture. It looks just like a circuit box, and they went into all of the great detail about how you can't alter that without it being fatal to the organism itself. So just kind of the work that they're doing at Discovery, kind of going into those mechanisms to talk about their unique, obviously to them, design.
Yeah, again, I don't know all of the people here's religious persuasion, but to me, the how God made humans is a scientific issue, and that all these options are biblically possible. Again, Bill, your question about who Adam and Eve were and when they lived is a more difficult question, but the how of humanity has lots of options that I would say easily fall within the text without twisting the text of what it could mean.
Well, speaking of the text, one thing I find really disturbing is, do you actually think Moses wrote Genesis?
Well, Moses wrote Psalm 90. It says a Psalm of Moses. I think that's true. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm not a liberal theologian scholar, who would talk about the JEPD sources of the Pentateuch. But, I think Moses probably wrote most of it,
Well,
but again, it's due to tradition. We
know
have
tradition, but you can go to any university. I mean, real seminaries like Vanderbilt, Princeton, Duke. Nobody believes that J and P wrote the first two
but
chapters.
nobody believes that the Gospels were written before 70 AD because Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. No, seriously.
I know they don't.
So
no, but the Gospels
no,
were written. Mark was the first 70 AD. Nobody believes
the main reason why the general consensus is the Gospels were written out after 70 AD is because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. If you take away that prediction and look at internal evidence, the evidence is that they were done before. So there's this bias against the traditional views that can't be erased in these seminaries.
Well, that could certainly be true, but the broad consensus is Mark at 70, Luke and Matthew 80.
Why?
Because that's scholarship. These people since
that's just not true, Bill. If you look at the internal evidence, it's much more likely they were written early. The only reason is Matthew, 24, where Jesus says the temple will be destroyed. It's the only reason that the dates are later. So again, but my point is, yes, of course you get consensus among scholars because they have bias and they have presuppositions that you're not
obviously, but I asked Kelsey, who's going to be speaking, Johnson, we really enjoyed her, but she's going to be speaking at a religious studies conference, and she didn't even know who Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison are.
I know who they are.
Yes, thank you.
So
Bingo.
I was talking to was talking to a friend of mine who knows Bart Ehrman well, and we were talking about things that Bart Ehrman says that are clearly just wrong, that he is clearly distorting the truth. And I asked my friend who knows him, how can he get away with that? And why does he really even believe it? Because they're clearly false. And my friend looked at me and said, do you know how much money Bart Ehrman is making by making these claims? In other words, he was telling me, and he knows Bart Ehrman well, that Bart is really disingenuous in some of the things he says.
We had Bart as a guest author. We did like the 20th or anniversary or however long it was since his book Misquoting Jesus, and to see if this position had changed on anything. And it was to me a kind of a frustrating book club, but he was kind enough to do it, and he was somewhat respectful. But he said something that kind of put this in context for me a little bit on some of the things that he said. But he said his wife is Christian. He clarified, he said, but not the kind of Christians you guys are, whatever that means. But he said all the time she complains and says, Bart, you're still a fundamentalist, even though you're an atheist. Yeah. And that may be that presupposition and stuff. I asked him some specific questions and things, but in one of the editions of the book, he said that he concurred with his mentor, Bruce Metzger at Princeton, who said that all the variants and all the New Testament variants do not materially affect any Christian doctrine. And he said he agrees with that. So I said, why didn't you say that in your book? He said, I did. It's almost on every page. And so, but the way he words it, it makes it sound like it's totally unreliable, more variants than there are words, and that we can't possibly know anything that the original documents may have said. Well, but then later in the chapter, he'll go through and tell you why he knows this is the actual correct reading. So apparently he can know what was actually said originally.
Wait a minute, James. I listened to Bart at UNC at one of his talks, and I asked him, does this affect doctrines? The changes in the text and so forth. He goes, I can make a list as long as my arm, his exact words. Yes, if you read Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, not his lay thing, Misquoting Jesus, you'll see that they intentionally changed the text, the scribes did, to combat.
Yeah, but I think his point is, even I would grant you that some of the variants could have been purposeful and not accidental, but what Bart was saying is we can recover the original. He can tell you what the readings are. And so there's a question on a small percentage, but even if you took out not just the long ending of Mark, but the entire book of Mark, you still have 3 other gospels to work with. So there's enough data in there that has no variance in it, no substantial variance in it, that it does not, he said, affects any Christian doctrine. But I just don't think he's that clear on that with the freshmen that are part of his class there at the University of North Carolina.
It seems to me that Bart Ehrman kind of spoke out of both sides of his mouth in a way, because he published a book with Bruce Metzger, if I understand this correctly, in 2006, that was drawing radically different conclusions than Misquoting Jesus, which was also published in 2006.
So, yeah, Dr. Metzger was upset, and I'd say upset's the wrong word, but Dr. Metzger was a little bit incredulous about the way Dr. Ehrman, his protege, went when he went to the popular level. But I think Ehrman discovered what it's like to be a New York Times bestseller. It's hard to judge motives, but he does seem to have a this doesn't matter. Oh, it does matter. It does matter. It doesn't matter. Michael, I have a quick question.
Yeah, we can get back to something I'm more familiar with.
Right.
I'm familiar with this, but yeah, right.
I know we've chatted many times at Defend over dinner and a couple interviews.
Yeah.
And I've always forget to ask you this question because it's always in the back of my mind, and it's just a lack of understanding. It's not a gotcha or anything, but with the Large Hadron Collider, you were on the paper that led to the discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012. When the principle of the collider, when you're accelerating particles at near the speed of light, is this machine built on the assumption about that smashing particles? Because when I think of smashing particles together, I think of crash test. What can we learn about automobiles from smashing them into walls? Safety tests, and so it would be hard to analyze an automobile all smashed up if you didn't know what it was. Are we losing something? Are we losing information when we're crashing particles together, or is this is how things are being revealed to us? What is the smashing? What's the trade-off in smashing particles?
So when I talk in public, I will say it's like smashing cars together to see what they're made of, because when you smash a car together, it breaks into smaller pieces and they come out. It's really a terrible analogy, but it's an understandable analogy, right? The two physics principles that come into play when we smash particles together is one is called the de Broglie wavelength. The de Broglie wavelength says that every particle is also a wave, and that the wavelength is inversely proportional to the momentum. The higher the momentum, the smaller the wavelength. And that if you want to probe something, you have to have a wavelength the size you want to probe. So if I want to probe deep into the structure of matter, I need a very high momentum, which according to the de Broglie wavelength gives me a very short wavelength, and therefore I can probe those short sizes. So if you do the math, a quark is less than 10 to the minus 18th meters in size. How do I know that? Because the momentum of the collider gives me a wavelength of 10 to the minus 18th meters, and I don't see structures in the quark at that level. Gotcha. The second principle for why we smash particles is Einstein's famous E equals mc squared, which most people don't really know what it means. What it means, so everybody gets hung up on the c squared. In fact, I once saw a Far Side where Einstein is writing E equals ma squared, and it's crossed out, and E equals mb squared, and it's crossed out, and E equals mc squared, and it's like, eureka, I discovered it. But the c squared is actually irrelevant because it's a constant. In particle physics, we set c equal to 1 because that's the easiest constant. So we just write E equals m, and that tells you what it really means. Mass is a form of energy. Now, what do we know about energy? It can't be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed from one form to the other. When you burn gasoline, you transform chemical energy to motion, kinetic energy. So the other real reason we smash particles is the kinetic energy of collision can change to mass. And we can create extremely massive particles that don't usually exist in nature except under extreme conditions, because we have enough energy to create their mass. So the kinetic energy of collisions changes to mass. That's how the Higgs is discovered. The Higgs, with a mass in energy units of 125 billion electron volts, is not you usually don't find in nature that much concentrated energy in a small enough place to excite the Higgs field and create a Higgs particle. You do near black holes, you do when certain cosmic rays hit the atmosphere, but you can't, study those because they're random. You don't know where or when they're going to be. But by controlling those collisions, we can create these massive particles from the kinetic energy and then study them.
And Peter Higgs was, I would say, vilified, but nobody believed him until 2012.
That's not true.
It isn't? Okay.
No, in fact, we spent 50 years and $20 billion because we believed him to find the Higgs particle.
What was so that just must be an urban legend. Did he not, when he first proposed this, were people skeptical then? Where is that coming from?
I think he thought that the challenges of finding the particle were so great it would never be discovered in his lifetime.
Okay.
That's what I would think. Yeah.
But he didn't get any. He wasn't ridiculed. In other words, or I don't know where I got that from.
No, in fact, quite the opposite. We have all these subatomic particles, and everyone is named after a Greek or Latin letter. The Z, and well, most of them. The proton is a P and the electron is an E. And so I think the Higgs really, he's the only one named after a person. So I don't like the name. If it was up to me, I would just call it the H particle and go along with all the other particles.
And
But-
the
So he's revered in some sense. Yeah.
yeah. But the unique thing is about the Higgs is that it's what, if I'm understanding this correctly, it's what gives it's the field that gives mass to everything else, right?
Well, everything else is a weird way of saying it. It's the field that gives mass to the fundamental particles. So a proton is not a fundamental particle. So it doesn't give mass to the proton. It gives mass to the quarks. But if you add up the mass of the quarks, they're an extremely small fraction of the proton mass. The proton mass is primarily a potential energy mass. It's the potential energy of the quarks inside the proton. So most of the mass of the universe, which is neutrons and protons, is really not caused by the Higgs boson, but caused by the potential energy of the quarks inside the neutrons and protons.
Okay, that's totally clear. I'm cleared up two misconceptions in my head.
There you go.
Thank you.
Hey, Mike, I got a question for you. You said the original working title of The Creator Revealed was Why Christians Ought to Believe in the Big Bang. I've seen some resistance on that, and I'm sure you did too, or you wouldn't have thought of writing the book. But could you just give us a quick summary, I guess, of kind of what you talked about it in chapter 2? What is the Big Bang? Why does this have anything at all to do with God or bring up the discussion of God? Why is it controversial with the atheist cosmologists and stuff as well?
Right. So, again, if you take the 6 days of Genesis as 24 hours and you take the genealogies as complete, which are both bad assumptions because they can both be shown to be wrong, then you get this age of 6,000 years. And the majority of Christians, who I would call conservative evangelicals, which is my bent, make those poor assumptions. And so they believe the universe is 6,000 years old. In the intro, I tell the story of Sarah, who was homeschooling her junior high kid, and she wanted to know what I believed and why, and none of the books I gave her were understandable. And so one of my strengths is to try to take complex subjects and make them understandable to a non-technical audience. So that was the motivation behind the book. So, again, up until 1929, when Hubble made his discovery of the expanding universe, most scientists thought the universe was eternal and that it always existed. When Hubble made his discovery, it began this journey of understanding that the universe apparently had a beginning about 13.8 billion years ago now. I just say 14. And that has possible philosophical and theological implications. If the universe had a beginning, then it brings in the idea of a beginner. And so I always joke that the Big Bang, so Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang. Fred Hoyle was an agnostic or an atheist. He didn't like the idea that the universe had a beginning. He was the one that developed a steady state model in which the universe is expanding, but constantly creating these little galaxies and all as it expands, so it can still be eternal, but look like it's expanding. And he came up with the term Big Bang because he thought it was silly enough that no one would ever believe the idea. The idea is if I come up with a term that's silly enough and stupid enough, then no one will believe the idea. So I always joke that the Big Bang is a dirty word to Christians and to non-believers. But nowadays, the Big Bang actually has two meanings. Its original meaning was the moment of the universe coming to existence. But now most scientists agree with me and everyone that we really don't know for certain what happened in the first 10 to the minus 30 seconds or so. So now the Big Bang is often referred to as this moment in time when we start to really understand the laws of physics, which is, some small number, I don't know, maybe 10 to the minus 20 seconds after the Big Bang, after the beginning or something. So I once read an article in the Wall Street Journal that said the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe. And then you read it, it's because he's defined the Big Bang as this moment 10 to the minus 20 seconds after the supposed origin when we know what happened. So you'll often hear scientists say, well, the Big Bang wasn't the beginning. It's because they've redefined it with this new idea that it's the moment when we start to understand the laws of physics. And we don't know what happened in the first 10 to the minus 30 seconds. But it's just easier for me to use it in its original meaning, which is the origin, the moment of the origin of the universe. So what is true is if you extrapolate all the known laws of physics and all the observations, you come to a point, if cosmic inflation occurred about 10 to the minus 30th seconds after the Big Bang, after the origin, in which we don't know what happened in that first 10 to the minus 30 seconds. We may never know what happened, but all of the observations and all the theory, including general relativity and the Bordy-Guth-Lincoln theory, would indicate that there was a real beginning. So you can speculate. I call it atheism of the gaps rather than God of the gaps. Everything we do know after 10 to the minus 30 seconds looks like a real beginning. Atheists don't like the fact that there was a real beginning, so they impose possible laws of physics in what we don't know the first 10 to the minus 30 seconds to try to eliminate the beginning. And I call that the atheism of the gaps. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
If the universe had a beginning, then the cause of the universe has to be outside of the universe, and the cause of the universe can't be material if all the stuff of the universe came into existence. So it looks like the cause is a lot like the biblical God, transcendent, immaterial, and that is a reasonable conclusion from the scientific evidence.
Yeah, Sean Carroll did a debate with Bill Craig. I think it was Bill Craig at
It was.
New
I've
Orleans.
listened to the debate.
Okay, and he seemed to be arguing that really that cosmological argument that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and so if the universe began to exist, it would have to have a cause. But the counterpoint, I think, from Sean Carroll, the atheist, was that that if you don't have those laws in place, then you don't have time, you don't have cause and effect, and so really you can throw everything we know out the window. We may not have to have a cause in that little gap between the 10 minus to the 30th T minus before time. In other words, you don't have causality.
Well, his reason for no causality is actually more fundamental than that. He would argue that the basic laws of physics are time reversible. They basically just describe patterns. They don't really give cause effect. So there's this prize that the Texas A&M University gives out called the Trotter Prize every year. And it's for people who have dialogued about science and religion. And in 2024, last year, Sean Carroll and I were the co-recipients of it. So we actually gave these lectures at Texas A&M where he talked about this, and I had a chance to dialogue with him about some of these things. I mean, his book, The Big Picture, is a great book. He is probably maybe the only thoughtful atheist scientist who actually writes in a thoughtful, reasonable way. I mean, you read, Victor Stenger and Richard Dawkins, and their arguments are terrible and they don't understand the people they disagree with. Sean Carroll's just the opposite. He understands people he disagree with. In general, his arguments are very good. But I think this idea that the laws of physics define patterns and within them there's no causality has some really big loopholes in it. I mean, I see where he's coming from, but I'm not sure I would even agree with him as a physicist. But that mantra has been picked up by other physicists now, that the laws of physics themselves have no causality because they describe patterns, and you can't ever talk about cause and effect within the laws of physics.
So it's like putting kind of putting divine attributes onto the physical creation when you're saying it's uncaused, right? You're just switching.
No, it's different. It's redefining in some sense what we think of as cause and effect based on his understanding of how the laws of physics work.
Okay.
So let's say God did create the Big Bang, get all this stuff going. Why did isn't it true that atoms didn't appear till 380,000 years after the Big Bang?
Mhm.
So why would you wait that long why not create atoms within the first 1,000 years?
So if you want to create a universe with the laws of physics that we know, and if you want to start with a point in time where it comes into existence, then everything happens pretty much as quick as it can. For instance, people, the movie Contact and the book Contact by Carl Sagan asked the question about the universe being so big. And, they make the statement that people make who are, in my opinion, naive. There's a lot of wasted space out there. If humans are important, why is the universe so big? There's a lot of wasted space, blah, blah, blah. The problem with that argument is that if you start with a Big Bang, the initial elements created in the periodic table are only hydrogen and helium in the first 3 minutes. All the other elements are created when stars die. And you have to run through 2 generations of stars to create enough oxygen, carbon, etc., for a solar system like ours. So if you start with the Big Bang and you want to create a planet like the Earth, the shortest amount of time you can have is 9 billion years. So the Earth is the earliest you could have a planet like ours. And because the mass density has to be finely tuned and the expansion rate has to be finely tuned, this is the shortest time you could have a planet like ours. It's also, therefore, the smallest universe you could have and have a single planet like ours, because size and time are correlated. And so to me, the question isn't why is the universe so big, or so, at least it seems like there's a lot of wasted space. It's why is the universe so small, and how do we get here in the shortest amount of time? It's as if we are part of the plan. And so if you start with a Big Bang and use the laws of physics, 380,000 years is the time it takes to create atoms. Now, could God have done it like that in a moment? Sure. But how long is 9 billion years or 14 billion years to a timeless God?
Well, we had Faz Rahman, Hugh Ross's guy on. And if man is the pinnacle of God's creation, if that's the whole reason for this deal, why is it at the very tail end of creation?
Again, it takes that long to create humans. That's the shortest amount of time it takes. So you're asking, why did God use that method instead of popping things into existence? Well, if you pop things into existence, there's no historical record of how finely tuned things are. If you let it start at the beginning, there's a historical record of that there was a beginning and that it's finely tuned. So it actually gives more credence to a creator by doing it this way than popping it into existence in some sense.
I think the point you made earlier is good to emphasize that, God is a timeless being. And for me, it's like, the microwave doesn't run fast enough for me. Why is it taking this long to make popcorn? So but for the timeless being, he did not create the universe on a budget. So it's just like, what's the cheapest way I could do this? It reflects a all-powerful, all-knowing God that could do this, which is a timeless being.
So let me even expand that more. So there's one speculation that quarks and leptons are made of strings. You've heard of the string theory idea. And one aspect of string theory, and this isn't necessarily true of string theory, but the landscape of string theory could allow up to 10 to the 500 universes or so. So I play this scenario. Suppose you're God and you say, I want to create one planet with human beings that I can have a relationship with, that I can love, blah, blah, blah. And let's base it on string theory. Oh, if I'm going to base it on string theory, I need to make 10 to the 500 universes in order to have one planet like the Earth. Well, no big deal. I'm God. I can do that. So to me, finding a multiverse might actually increase the evidence for God. It depends on what the multiverse model is. And, Jeff Zverink, from Reasons to Believe, wrote a book called Who's Afraid of the Multiverse for Christians who think the multiverse is somehow the death knell of fine tuning and the death knell of needing a creator. But so far, every time we find new evidence about the universe, it continues to point more deeply to God. So my thought is, we find a multiverse that may do the same thing.
Lawrence Krauss is one of our atheist guests.
Yeah.
We reviewed his book on Universe from Nothing.
I have read that. Yep.
And by the time we did, that was like 10 years later, so it was like he'd been beat up quite a bit from various sources on equivocating with what nothing really is and that kind of thing. But the interesting thing was he appealed to both string theory and in our conversation and a multiverse, but he didn't seem to be a real fan of it.
No, well, there's possibly no experimental evidence for it. So it's
that's what he seemed. He seemed to be like it's and who's the woman atheist cosmologist who's has the YouTube channel? We've talked about having her as a guest.
Sabine Hassenfelder.
Yeah. She was talking about some what she considers to be total fraud going on in academia.
Yeah, I've read that article. I don't agree with her, but she's pretty strong. Yeah, I think that article is not the best representation of what's really going on.
Okay. I was wondering about that. So what is your take? Is string theory promising still?
I don't know. Again, the search for a quantum theory of gravity has been going on since Einstein, and we don't have any good solution to it, and string theory is a possible one. So, and it might never be experimentally verified. So, where do you go with that? I don't know. Let me go back to Larry Krauss. The joke I make about Krauss is the only two people that believe his definition of nothing is really nothing is him and Dawkins. Yeah.
I can't remember the comedian right now that took him apart on that on one of the late
Stephen Colbert.
Yes, Stephen Colbert. It was hilarious. But
could if God doesn't exist, could God be nothing? Basically saying could then God then created the universe according to Lawrence Krauss. Yeah, that was funny. Michael, I was wondering too, when we're talking about particles, I loved our conversation with you and Luke in Defend. That was so much fun for me, kid in the candy stores. But when we're talking about particles and cosmology, I mean, I had Luke next to me, so you guys I should have just had you guys ask each other questions because it was fun to listen to. But in relation to particles, when you talk about the beginning of the universe, as Bill said, some 380,000 years after the initial expansion or the origin of the universe, if there was no particles, were no particles, what was the state?
There were no atoms. There were no atoms.
There were particles.
Nuclei formed in the first 3 minutes, but the universe is so hot that if atoms are electrons bound to a nuclei, if the electrons tried to bound to a nuclei, there was too much heat. Heat is motion, energy, right? There's too much heat for them to be stably bound to the nucleus. So you have electrons and you have nuclei, but you don't yet have atoms.
Okay. All right.
And so any light that is emitted from anything as it vibrates gets immediately reabsorbed by the sea of electrons and nuclei. And not until you form atoms does the universe become transparent. So this is what the cosmic microwave background is. It's the last imprint of when the universe becomes transparent and how the light was distributed at that time, or the first imprint of when the universe becomes transparent. And it really is just because the temperature is too high to have a stable atom for electrons to bind to the nucleus.
Do you, Michael, see? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, no.
I was just kind of a follow-up on that. The idea I was talking about this very subject with Larry Shapiro today on our interview. And Larry has debated or has discussed with John Lennox, pretty smart philosopher fellow. He and I got into the part, I mean, we didn't get into it. We were just discussing it. The dividing line between natural and supernatural. Because at some point, if you take Hebrews 1:3 and it says that God upholds all things by the word of his power, we were talking about miracles. I said, where's the dividing line between something that's naturally occurring? Like, how would a skeptic know what the difference between a naturally occurring event and a supernatural event? When, as a theist perspective is that God is kind of what inspired, the natural philosophers, the Robert Boyles and the James Clerk Maxwell's, that God's upholding everything in some sense. And so there really is nothing natural, for lack of a better word. It's all upheld by God in a supernatural kind of way that is beyond our transcendence. So how is it, like, could you possibly look at everything that you're talking about in physics as a hallmark of what God is doing rather than a separation of natural, supernatural? Is it God did all this and it's just doing it on its own, or do you see it as God upholding all of this processes that you're studying?
So when I talk to Christians who are scientifically minded or whatever, my viewpoint is in the minority. Okay. My viewpoint is the universe, if God were to walk away somehow, the universe would keep working. If it's a perfectly designed watch, where other people take that verse more literally or whatever and say, no, if God was to walk away, since he upholds it, it would kind of fall apart. But I see it working too well. The laws of physics are how God made the universe work, right? The watchmaker can walk away, and or the computer programmer can walk away, and if it's done right, it's going to keep going. So I see it differently. I don't think that verse is talking about upholding the physical universe. I think it's more a metaphysical idea. There is no meaning. There is no universe without God. But again, when I talk to other scientists who are believers, that my view tends to be in the minority. But,
Okay.
but again, so I like to think of three categories: natural, which is the way that laws of physics usually operate; supernatural, which is God. People describe it differently. I don't know the best way. I kind of think of it as the programmer knows all the back doors. And so God's the programmer. He knows how to manipulate the back doors when he wants to do something outside the usual workings of nature. And then there's another thing that some theologians or people call hypernaturalism. And hypernaturalism is when you have a natural event that is highly unlikely but occurs. So I think the formation of our moon is such a thing. The moon plays a huge role in allowing complex life on the Earth. And the way the moon formed, we think, is that a Mars-sized asteroid hit the Earth at just the right angle, at just the right time, at just the right speed to give just the right moon that we needed, right? So that's a natural event, but it's extremely unlikely for this planet, for any planet, much less this planet that has all the other requirements for life. So that's sometimes called a hypernatural event. In other words, you can explain it totally naturally, but it sure looks like there's something behind it. And so I like to think of the history of events in history as falling into one of those three categories rather than just two categories.
Okay.
Hey, Phil, I think Phil Bear had a statement or question about trying to have a natural explanation for supernatural events or vice versa. Did you want to address that or just leave it in the text, Phil?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat that I'm not really following, but that's okay. It's
hard to multitask.
Talking about, yeah.
I can leave it in the chat and let it speak for itself, but if anybody wants any clarification, I'd be happy to discuss it further. But this is derived from what I wrote about in my book Machines Don't Laugh. I address the issue of the age of the universe and the creation of the universe and so on, and it's in a chapter called Philosophy Disguised as Science. So take it for what it is, take it or leave it. And
So
if you want
let
any
me
questions.
throw out another option. You say if God created the universe, the beginning of the universe was a supernatural event. Maybe, maybe not. Again, all we're told in the Bible is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The process is not told. We usually assume it's an ex nihilo from nothing. suppose God had a previous universe and he used some collision of brains and string theory mumbo jumbo to create this universe. It would not
The universe is all the way down.
Genesis 1:1. What's that?
Universe is all the way
So
down.
it's the universe is all the way down.
Well, again, there'd have to be somewhere that something probably if God's immaterial, which we believe as Christians, there would be some place along the chain where you have to have a first one. That, it's not turtles all the way down, but to me, even if we found a collision of two brains causing this universe, it doesn't necessarily contradict what we're told in the Bible, that this universe had a beginning that God created, because God uses natural events to create things. We know that all of our bodies were created naturally. God clearly says that he's in charge of that. It's his doing. So I don't know. Again,
it's a model that we see throughout creation. So from the Christian perspective, is the book of Ephesians, is the author Paul or is the author God? And it's both and.
Right. And this is, again, this is one of my kind of beefs with young earth creationists. They seem to imply, although they don't say it, is if it's a supernatural event, then God's involved. But if it's a natural event, evolution, then God's not involved. That's just contradictory to what the Bible says about God. It says supernatural, or, the Bible says God feeds the lions. It's an active tense, but ancient people knew lions were fed by hunting. It says God makes wine, but ancient people knew wine was made by grapes fermenting. So there, in the Bible, there is no clear differentiation between God doing a supernatural event and being the cause of it, and God doing natural events and being the cause of it. And so that's my mindset. This is why it comes to evolution. God created humans. I don't know how. I think there's scientific problems with evolution, but if that's what we find out to be true, I don't see any problem with it biblically, or it doesn't take away from the fact that God created humans.
I would say though that there's a fundamental difference between the processes of creation in history and the actual creation of space, time, and matter itself, which is a singularity. So we can't really appeal to non-singularities in Scripture in order to apply that same reasoning to the singularity, because at some point, space, time, and matter didn't exist, and then at some point it did. And that particular boundary between non-existence and existence of space, time, and matter itself, no matter whether it was a universe five universes ago or not, that still has to be a supernatural event, and it still has to be a singularity.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. But again, and I tend to believe this is the first universe of this type material, and it's created ex nihilo. I have no evidence against that. But again, I'm just saying things that the Bible is not clear on, like was there a previous universe to this one, we need to hold loosely, not tightly.
It is interesting that when from the Greco-Roman world up until 100 years ago, a steady state model of some sort held sway, and you had these, Jewish, what do they call them? Iron Age goat herders who posited this idea of ex nihilo creation, and to think that just within our lifetime, the discoveries were made that yes, the universe almost certainly did have a beginning, and the data is finally catching up with the Iron Age goat herders.
It's the famous quote by Jastrow that scientists have reached the top of the mountain, and there's a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. I totally agree. Again, I'm a little jaded in that I hear Christians often say, oh, it couldn't have happened this way because this is my understanding of the Bible. And then when we find out it did happen that way, we look foolish. So the things that the Bible's not clear on, although, I hold loosely. I think it's relative. What you said is true. Somewhere along the chain, material had to come from immaterial. And my best guess, based on what I know from science, is that it happened with this universe. That's what the evidence seems to point to. But if the evidence changes, it doesn't negate what the Bible says about the creation of this universe. That's all I'm saying.
So Mike,
Even if the multiverse theory is plausible, it just simply suggests some kind of universe generating mechanism that itself must be finely tuned.
Yeah, the multiverse doesn't solve the origin problem. It supposedly solves the fine-tuning problem, but I'm not even convinced it does that for many, many reasons. Yeah.
so Dr. Strauss, you said that after you retire, you're going to try to devote yourself to teaching these churches biblical creation. Or, I mean, don't you think that it's these young earthers that believe in 6,000 years, which contradicts geology, anthropology, paleontology, physics, obviously. Don't you think it's hopeless getting through to these people?
No, actually, I just gave a bunch of talks in Daytona Beach, and I convinced 3 church and scientific leaders who are young Earth that old Earth is probably correct.
Well, good for you. I mean, because answers in Genesis, when I used to be a Christian, they just have an impact. They have infiltrated these churches, and it's just terrible.
Bill, it's still the case. But again, this was my motivation for the book. And I have the church I go to, we have 8 pastors. All of them were young Earth creationists when I joined the church 25 years ago. I think one of them still is. So minds can change when you have to speak their language. You have to make sure that they recognize you as someone who affirms their core beliefs. And then you can, through persuasion and using the language they understand, change minds.
And here's the thing.
Yeah.
Like we've had Dale Allison on. So he goes, oh, I don't believe those birth narratives are hopelessly contradictory. I don't see a lot of, history in them. Oh, and the post-resurrection appearances probably didn't happen. And the trial, obviously that's fiction. So you can be a Christian and realize that the Bible is hopelessly contradictory and has major problems, both Old and New Testament, and you can still be a Christian, right?
Probably. That's not the circle of Christians I run around with. And I would actually argue with you on your statements.
Well, I'm just saying that's what Dale Allison, he's the top 5 scholars in the world. He's the expert, not me.
Yeah, but there are experts who would disagree with him. And so, so I tend to believe that the Bible is basically a historically accurate document. I think archaeology shows that to be true. I mean, I can give you point after point where people said there's no archaeological evidence, and then it's found. David being a real person was found the last 20 years. Pilate being the governor of Judea.
Caesarea Maritima.
The pool of Siloam was found in 2004, and that wasn't supposed to be there. The people being buried in a private tomb were crucified wasn't supposed to be true until we discovered the ankle bone of someone with a nail in it in a private tomb. Over and over again, things that are said to be not true in the Bible because it was never done that way, archaeology shows to be true.
Well, that's where atheists make the mistake, is they say there's no evidence. They're certain, like you just articulated, there is evidence. But you also got nutcase things like the zombies, you're familiar with those in Matthew and stuff, that even Christians like Mike Licona say this isn't true.
But why do they say it's not true?
Because it's apocalyptic legendary embellishment. It's not history or fact.
Wait, that's a statement with nothing to back it up. I can say that George Washington wasn't true, but or some, that the chopping down the cherry tree wasn't true. Well, it might be. There's no evidence that it is true, but there's no evidence it's false either.
Well, it's like Bill, when you're talking about a documentary hypothesis, I can just apply what you're saying to Pride and Prejudice. You know Pride and Prejudice, right? Jane Austen wrote it. Well, no, she didn't write it. Actually, it was created by a community of redactors who were representing a women who were underappreciated authors back in the 18th century. And the reason we know it's not Jane Austen is because in the second half of the novel, we learn for the first time that Mr. Darcy's first name, which is Fitzwilliam. Well, why didn't this occur in the first half of the novel? Well, because redactors took over in the second half of the novel and decided to just haphazardly give him the name of Fitzwilliam without recognizing that in the beginning of the book, there's also a character called Colonel Fitzwilliam. And so therefore, if it was one author working, she would have had the continuity to know that she'd made a mistake by giving Mr. Darcy the name of somebody else of a minor character. But since obviously this came later, it must have been written by two people. There you go.
But here's the problem, Dan, is when I spoke at the church, Pleasant View, me and James spoke at, I told them very specifically, Timothy was not written by Paul. And by the way, James, Paul did not write Ephesians. So Christians, and I hope you can communicate, Mike, to these Christian churches that there is only 7 authentic letters of Paul. Now, if you agree or disagree, at least teach them what the consensus is. Does that make sense, Mike?
No, again, I don't agree with the consensus because I see the bias of that consensus. I don't agree that Mark was written after 70 simply because Jesus could never have predicted that the temple fell. That is the reason. Go look it up. The reason for the consensus is because
obviously they just don't come up with this stuff. It's years of American scholarship.
The reason for the consensus, the only reason for the consensus, is that Jesus could not have predicted the destruction of the temple.
But you do believe there's only 7 authentic letters of Paul, correct?
No.
You can't go against that.
Bill, how would you even recognize an original letter of Paul? How would you personally, Bill Cluck, recognize a letter?
When you have in Timothy, you have a church structure with bishops and stuff. That remember in Corinthians, he didn't have any bishops to appeal to. You don't have that in earlier Pauline letters, and scholars devote their lives to this stuff.
And check out
scholars
Acts
writing.
16, we can get into this later, Bill, but Acts 16, episkopos, poimen, shepherd, pastor, bishop, and episkopos, which is all 3 are used to refer to the pastors from Ephesus who went to Miletus to talk to Paul, using all 3 titles. Now, later in ecclesiology, 2nd, 3rd century, yes, these became important offices in the church, but all 3 terms were used for the leadership existing during the time of Paul's life when he met with them at Miletus on his way to Jerusalem.
Hey, Bill, what do you think about 1 Corinthians? Do you lump that in as one of your, Super 7? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, Corinthians was written by Paul.
Okay. Well,
I'm giving you guys a bone. You don't need
Bill,
all the letters to be correct to be a Christian.
Bill, but here's the problem. Paul, in writing in 1 Corinthians about 55 AD, quotes scripture, which the only place I can find this to be the case of what he's quoting is from the Gospel of Luke, which you can't quote a book that hasn't been written yet. So that's going to put Luke prior to 55 AD. It's going to put Mark
that's
and
the
Matthew.
nail in the coffin. Seriously, it shows that it was written by 55 AD. But since Jesus could never have predicted the destruction of the temple, it must have been written in 70. That is logic.
Well,
Yeah,
even most evangelical scholars would not say that Mark was written before Paul.
Well, that's why you have to give Mark an even earlier date.
Yeah. The problem, though, Ken, is that the internal evidence goes against what Mike's saying with this bias that they have. And I mean, the problem is you have to find another
being evangelical
scripture.
bias of evangelical scholars. Is that what you're talking about? Because I mean,
Sure.
it's very rare to find evangelical
Absolutely.
scholars.
Yeah.
Well,
Sometimes
my brother is a New Testament evangelical scholar, and he will talk about the various options as to when the Gospels were written. There
Does he
isn't
believe
a
that-
total consensus on that.
But if he believes that Mark was written before Paul, that would put him in a very small minority, even among evangelicals.
Well, no, I don't know what his position is. My only point is that and Paul wrote over a series of time. So to say Mark was written before First Corinthians is not saying Mark was written before Ephesians, right?
Right.
So
I mean,
say Mark was written before Paul, that's a broad statement. You have to be more specific.
right. I mean, most evangelical scholars think that Mark was written probably in the late 60s.
So he could have written it before
that-
Rome. Maybe he wrote the Epistle to the Romans, perhaps.
You have the other evidence that every possible detail about the Paul was recorded by Luke in the book of Acts, except the most important thing is death, and that's completely left out. It's circumstantial, but pretty powerful circumstantial evidence that if it had happened already, it would have been in the book. And so,
well, in John 5 too, the portico, John says there is at the sheep gate a pool, and this was not known to have existed until it was archaeologically discovered in 1888, and confirming what people thought was just mythical. But John's use the present tense vocabulary of the verb "there is a pool" suggests what Michael has been saying, that if John is writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, he might have said something like, well, there was a pool, or it's no longer there, but there was a pool. But it seems to indicate, I mean, it's an argument from silence, but all four of the Gospels mention nothing of the destruction of the temple. And some of these are suggesting that they're being written right around the time of the destruction of the temple.
Yeah. And Dan Wallace talks about the use of the historical present too, that it couldn't be that.
It started when Bill challenged Mike to ask about the authorship of the Pentateuch, and
Moses.
Then it went into the JEPD and so forth, and then it went into the New Testament because of the bias and all that. But I remember reading, even as a Christian, I'm no longer a believer, but as a Christian, reading just devotionally through the Old Testament and coming upon Genesis 36, where it talks about in the past tense, it says these were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. And so, obviously there were no Israelite kings before Moses. So, and he's talking in the past tense. So this is not an anti-supernatural bias that leads a person to think, oh, well, there's something going on here.
I have no problems. I have no problems with scribes adding things throughout.
And there's several of these, even like the beginning of Deuteronomy, it talks about, these are the things that happened on the other side of the Jordan, referring to where Moses was. So the author is writing from the west side of the Jordan, referring to what happened on the east side of the Jordan where Moses was.
Well, and Deuteronomy records Moses' death. He clearly didn't.
Well, yeah, you add up enough of these, and then it suggests very strongly that perhaps, I mean, you have to keep making exceptions. Well, maybe
again, the Pentateuch, what I say is it's traditionally written by Moses. I'm not making strong claims about it.
Right.
And as Bill has pointed out, there are Christians who have different opinions on this. I just think that someone wrote in the chat that or was something about consensus is not truth or something. And I definitely agree with that, particularly when consensus does not equal fact. Phil wrote that, particularly when you can show the bias of the consent of the people that are making the consensus. In physics, we do.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to. The analogy I've used with Bill is that in a jury of your peers, both the prosecution and the defense are going to put expert witnesses up there. And our job as the jury is not to become experts and go get a PhD in those topics before we can adjudicate or come to some kind of conclusion, but to weigh the evidence from both sides, the strengths and weaknesses of the argument, and then determine which is most probably true? Which is it, the prosecution's expert witness or the defense's expert witness? But it seems like Bill sometimes just wants to throw up his hands and say, well, the experts have spoken. I can't have an opinion.
But
And
the lay
they have to
person
convince us. They can't just have their opinion. They have to convince us of this.
in the churches Mike is going to be talking to, they are not capable of understanding. They don't know what Q is. They don't know the documentary hypothesis or whatever. So what I'm saying, and this is my gospel for you got Christians, is get the bad news out. Because some young punk with a YouTube channel is going to find out about Noah's flood and give you evidence, and the Christians are just, oh, my faith is done. So get the bad news out. Does that make sense, Mike?
So, Bill, what I will say is that we all have some beliefs that are likely true and some beliefs that are likely not. As a scientist who's a Christian who thinks that the belief among many Christians that the universe is 6,000 years old is a detriment to the message we as Christians really want to get out. So I can't fight every battle. My battle that I fight as a scientist who's a Christian is my area of expertise, trying to convince other Christians that the biblical record is consistent with a plain reading of the biblical record is consistent with what science has said. And if I can change some minds in that area, then I've done my part. We can deal with other things with other experts. And I have changed many, many minds in that area.
Well, good.
This non-believer thanks you very much for your service. You are doing a great job.
There you go.
There's a big task still to go, Ken. Because, and everywhere I speak, I'll give what I call scientific evidence for God. You can see the talks on YouTube and all. And I can guarantee that there will be a Christian who adamantly opposes what I'm saying and will adamantly want to argue with me about what Genesis actually means.
Well, and to me, I think it does help the Christian perspective or position to do what you're doing, because I've been on both sides. I was a young Earth creationist, and I was a old Earth creationist, then a theistic evolutionist, now a naturalistic evolutionist.
Wow, all four columns in one person.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it might be a first for me, actually.
But but the thing that, and I agree that naturalistic evolution is a tough pill to swallow. It's just it seems so incredibly, just impossible. So I'm not even expecting people to believe that. I mean, at least believe that the Earth is old, because that's so easy. That's easy pickings. And for me, as a non-believer, if I'm engaging with a believer who has that position, it's almost hard for me to take them seriously on anything else they might say, just because, well, if you can be so misguided about that one thing that's so clearly untrue, then what else are you applying that same faulty thinking to when you're arguing with me about why Christianity is true or anything else that you believe?
You know the quote by Augustine about this? I mean, it's a great quote. Yeah. Basically saying, if we say stupid things about the natural world that others know, how will anybody believe us when we talk about the resurrection, things like that? And that, Ken, you said it perfectly. This is what I consider. Again, I will talk to atheists and explain why I think the Big Bang and the fine tuning points to a God, but I'll also, that's half my night job. The other half of my night job is that trying to convince Christians that just what you're saying, that if you are espousing this view, you are damaging our whole message, and we need to reverse this. And again, I've seen growth in that area. So I was on an elevator in Daytona Beach, and I mentioned, somebody asked, are you here for business or pleasure? And I use the same terminology. Well, I'm here kind of for my night job. And the guy says, oh, you're a stripper. So that's what my night job is, I guess. I don't know.
Is there anybody else that had a question or comment? I've not been able to follow the texting very well. So did anybody have a question for Mike?
Mike, could you maybe, in all of your experience in talking with people on the young Earth side, is there anything that you've heard over the years that what would be, I guess, maybe what, even though maybe you don't believe it, what do you think their strongest argument for a young earth is?
Yeah.
Even though I know you might find it ridiculous.
Like Ken, you know, I grew up in an environment that was mostly young earth. I decided to study, what changed my mind was studying the Bible and what it really said, not the science. That to me was, you know, because I knew that the biggest obstacle for most people is, what does the Bible actually say? Who believe the earth is young? And it was studying the Bible for myself, kind of the things I shared in Genesis and all, that convinced me that young earth was a bad design. Also, the best Hebrew scholars like Gleason Archer will say that the word yom in Genesis cannot mean 24 hours within the context. So it was studying good Hebrew scholars that convinced me that this young earth interpretation is a bad interpretation based on the English translation of the Bible itself. That doesn't answer your question. What was your question again?
What do you think is, of all the arguments that you have heard?
Oh yeah,
is there one that you find to be what their strongest?
There aren't. Every scientific evidence, there's a few unanswered questions, but everyone is one half of a story. Like, there's too much salt in the ocean. Well, they're neglecting all the mechanisms that take salt out of the ocean. Oh, there's too little dust on the moon. They're actually using a measurement that was eventually taken away, redacted, said it was a bad measurement. I mean, there isn't one. I mean, the only, like, my pastor who's younger says, well, that's my best understanding of the Bible, and he says, I'm not a scientist, so I go with that. So the only evidence is if you take the days as 24 hours and the genealogy as complete. And again, within the Hebrew, both of those are bad assumptions. But if you take within the English, they look like good assumptions. So if you take those assumptions, it's the only way you come to a young earth.
Now, the age question itself, did that originate with Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin in an ancient universe? Is that really where it came from in the modern sense of the word?
No, the geologists in a Christian worldview in the 18th century before Darwin Darwin was the 19th century. We're discovering that the earth was at least millions of years old. The idea that the earth is old predates Darwin, and it's mostly done by geologists within a Christian worldview. It wasn't, the young earth took hold in the early 20th century as kind of a knee-jerk reaction to evolution, which by that time Huxley and others had kind of said evolution is synonymous with atheism. And there was this knee-jerk reaction by Seventh-day Adventists and others. Well, how can we combat evolution equals atheism? Oh, let's interpret Genesis as being 24-hour days. And so it wasn't until the early 20th century that was kind of codified. And then Henry Morris and somebody, I forget his name, wrote a book about it.
Charles Whitcomb.
Yeah, Whitcomb. And then in the 60s, Henry Morris writes the Genesis flood. And now the flood is the cause of all the appearance of age. And it's now codified within evangelical Christianity.
So you don't believe in a global flood, right?
What's that?
You don't believe in a global flood.
No, I don't. Yeah.
Have you read the Creationist by Ronald Numbers, talking about John McCready Price and the Seventh-day Adventist connection that led to Henry Morris? It's basically
I know that I haven't read that, but I know the history of it.
a fascinating history.
Yeah, I often show this to Christians who believe in a young earth, who think it's what the early Jewish and Christian fathers believed, and they were kind of agnostic. I mean, most of them took the days as being maybe 1,000 years, because Moses writes 1,000 years with God is as a day, and a day is 1,000 years. So, okay, each day of creation is 1,000 years. That was a common Jewish belief for a long time. But yeah, so no, most Christians don't know the history of how this young earth dogma came into effect.
Do you think it's last question on this whole topic? Do you think, and this would be a young, I'm not making it personally, it's just one I hear, because I hear both sides. Do you think the whole issue of reading a chronological age into the text of Scripture is problematic for either side to be dogmatic about it. Like we're reading modern knowledge of the universe into an ancient text that doesn't give us an exact chronology that science proposes.
Yeah, I mean, so when I first started in my 20s, I was a graduate student at UCLA and I had my Christian beliefs. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to be a Christian and scientist, I need to understand what I believe about this. So that's when I did a deep dive into the Bible. I knew what the science said, but I really wanted to not distort the biblical text because I have a high view of scripture. And so and the first thing I learned is that there isn't a consensus. There are certainly some people who believe the 6 days of creation have no chronology whatsoever. They're simply an outline that takes care of the problems in verse 2. The earth is formless and void. Days 1 through 3 take care of the formless. Days 4 through 6 take care of the void. It's a storytelling, procedure, and there is no chronology. It's not the majority view, but and so again, there are at least 11 possible views of what the days of creation are. I have a view, the day age theory. I think each day is an age. That's my preferred view. It fits in with what we know of science. I showed you the 10 points. It fits in well. Is it the right view? I don't know. And I won't know until if the things I believe are true and I find out when I get to heaven, right? So I think they're all possibilities, except a young earth. I don't think science pretty much rules that out. But I think the other 10 are all possible views of what the original writer meant. So,
Okay.
Hey, Mike, can I ask you one question? And if this is something you don't want to go into or you're not, what on your mind, but what are your reasons for thinking that it was a local flood and not a global flood?
The geologists who say there's no evidence of a global flood. So the biggest Christian organization of scientists is the Christian geologists. Lots of scientific disciplines have a Christian organization. And I've talked to them, not 99% of them say there's no evidence for a global flood. And all the evidence I read from the young earth creationists is so easily refutable. There's fossils in mountains. Well, what does tectonic activity do? It pushes fossils up into mountains. That their reasoning for a global flood is just ridiculous. A great book is, young earth creationists take this tour of the Grand Canyon and show all the reasons why the Grand Canyon points to a global flood. So there's a book called The Grand Canyon, A Monument to an Ancient Earth, written by Christians, and it goes through every young earth argument that they would tell you in the Grand Canyon, and then tells the real argument, and you can read and decide yourself. There just is no evidence for a global flood.
Hey, by the way, Mike, if you ever come to Dallas, the Institute for Creation Research is here.
I do.
And they did this thing called the Rate Project, where they spent all this.
I know the Rate Project well. It's a piece of garbage.
And they found all this daughter element, and they said, "Oh my gosh, we got a problem. We gotta fit science of scripture." You know what they did? They go, "Oh, it's accelerated radiometric decay," which,
I know,
as you know, as a physicist, will melt the Earth's crust and burn up.
I know. Well, but the supernatural God could keep it from doing that, Bill.
Oh yeah, well, I forgot the air conditioning. Excuse me.
But yeah, again, the hoops you have to jump through, that Bill Russell's idea of general relativity and how we can see light from distant planets, or the other idea is that light travels at an infinite speed towards us, but at a finite speed away from us, and I can only measure round trips speed of light. So I mean, the mental gymnastics they do, the analogy I give, it's like I already believe in Santa Claus. So I discard all evidence that he can't exist. And I only say, well, look, there was a cookie that was eaten, and there's a present that says it's from Santa Claus, and nobody will claim that that present is not from Santa Claus. So Santa Claus must be real. And I'm completely discarding all the other options and all the evidence against Santa Claus. That is a good analogy of how the young earth works. And again, I like this forum because here's something we agree on. It is hurting those of us who believe the Christian message is correct, Jesus rose from the dead, it's hurting our ability to share that message with educated scientists and those who know the truth about things like the age of the earth, because we don't have any credibility.
Well, as Hugh Ross says, if we can't trust them on the natural things, how are we going to trust them on the spiritual things?
And Augustine
He's got a
said
good
the same
point.
thing. Augustine said the same thing. So that's not a new idea. So again, this is, and this was the motivation for this book. It's like, and it's had this impact. Again, I've seen many Christians change their mind. If I was to rewrite it, I would not quite write it for that audience, because I know a lot of people have given it to non-believing people, because it does point how the Big Bang and the fine-tuning agrees with the Bible. But so I would probably make it less geared in its presentation to Christians. When you read it, you know, you can tell who it's geared to. But that was not how I was thinking about it as I was writing it. So I got to write another one that's not quite so geared in that manner or something. I don't know.
Hey, Bill, while you've got him here, you know, Mike has a bit to say about fine tuning and design in his book. And, you know, we've had a lot on that in the last couple of months, our own discussions in the book club. But since that's an issue that's important to you right now, is there any question that you had for him about fine tuning, or you want to share what you've wrestled with the most?
Well, Dan pointed out the fine structure constant, and it just, even that, if that's not within a certain parameter, you don't get carbon and oxygen. And plus, the mass of the electron interacts with the electromagnetic force. Is that right?
Not the mass, just the charge. Well, it plays a role in stability of stars and other things. There's this fine tuning between the mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, the gravitational constant, the electromagnetic constant, that does a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it is. I mean, see, that's such compelling evidence for God. You don't want to mess it up by saying insane things like the universe is 6,000. And I'm so with you.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and you know, again, you mentioned Luke Barnes and A Fortunate Universe. I love that book, right? Because there are those like Sabine Hossenfelder and others who say, well, the design is just man-made, it's not real or whatever. And here you have Geraint Lewis and Luke Barnes, an atheist and a Christian, who adamantly agree that it looks designed and that it looks finely tuned, and then just disagree on whether it's a multiverse or God. And so I recommend, and it's got Australian humor in it. What else could you ask for? So, you know, I recommend that book all the time.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Have we published the podcast with Luke and Mike yet?
Yeah, it's on Good Heavens.
On Good Heavens,
Mm-hmm.
Good Heavens ! Is our other podcast. And if you guys want to go here to get the two of them in the same room talking about these things, Luke Barnes and Dr. Strauss, excellent conversation. And you can go to Good Heavens wherever
On Apple or Spotify.
Yeah.
It's Good Heavens with an exclamation point and a Big Dipper in our little graphic. But right now, those are the two. Wayne and I just did a podcast on the sun. And just to let you all know, Good Heavens, how many do you guys all have? You know Good Heavens? I don't know how many of y'all know what the podcast is, but it's basically my friend Wayne. He's got a background. He's got a master's in physics. He was a science teacher for a while. He does independent physics research. Wayne is a young Earth creationist. I am kind of ambivalent about the age question, but we approach the podcast from a both and perspective and trying to find subjects and topics upon which all Christians can agree. And we don't push an age one way or the other. I mean, sometimes we get into young Earth topics and Wayne will get on his soapbox, but we will also entertain. We've had lots of old Earth creationists on our show, Michael and Luke included. And so we don't run away from that. We don't condemn it. We try to find middle ground that all Christians can take from our podcasts and go off into the four winds of the earth and discover things on their own. But we try to bring it all back to things that we do agree about as Christians in terms of what's most important related to Jesus.
To me, it's really fascinating about how the very large cosmology and the very, very small particle physics both raise philosophical and really theological issues the more you dig into them. It's, to me, fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we try to be respectful with that podcast. We've been doing it for 8 years. And we've had a lot of great guests. We've had Hugh Ross. We've had as many scientists as I can think of on the podcast who are in the Christian realm. We've had Danny Faulkner. We've had Stephen Siegmeyer. We've had Jeff Zwirink. We've had Michael on a couple of times. So we really try to bring in a broad perspective and not just close it down to one way, but here's what both sides say. Here's what the Bible says about Jesus. That's kind of what Good Heavens is. And we try to be knowledgeable and respectful about
I mean,
both
all
sides
that
of the issue.
sounds really congenial and everything, but at some point there are certain facts that are so um, well established that to say that it's still an open question or there's room for doubt or discussion, I mean, it's an insult to to common sense and to just everything that stands to reason. I mean, I don't want to be harsh, but that's a topic. There's some issues that, should we tax more? Should we tax less? You can debate about things like that, or should we, or if you want to argue about predestination or free will or things like that, where you can find genuine differences. But when it comes to the age of the earth, there's really no wiggle room. I mean, it's not a question of being, leaving both sides.
The only wiggle room, which I totally reject, is if God made the earth look old as if it had a history, not just an ancient earth, but with a past history, which makes God a deceiver.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so to me, I agree. This, I treat Christians who believe in a young earth with dignity. I treat people who don't think we've landed on the moon with dignity. But there is absolutely no good reason to believe those things. And I think
And discredit. I mean,
yes,
it's not just the people who are actively promoting young earth creationism, even saying that you're open to it, to me, is just as much of a discredit, because you should be studying and realizing what the facts are, if it's that important.
Yeah, when you can take every supposed scientific evidence for this view and show why it's wrong, and you can take every scriptural evidence and show why it at least could be wrong, then there is no credible reason to believe it. And I tend to agree with you. Again, I'm not this strong in public in general, because I'm making my point other ways. But, in private, I agree with you. I think it should be wiped from the face of the earth. Yeah.
Well, we don't agree on everything, but I think you and I agree on that at least.
Well, again, I always joke, when I get to heaven, I'm going to find out I was wrong about certain things, and most things I'll just go, okay. But if I'm wrong about the age of the universe, I always say God and I are going to have a really long talk. I'm not ever going to figure that one out. So,
Well, I want to say, in my friend Wayne's defense, we recognize there are a lot of Christians that are interested in science that are young earth. And we've done this for 8 years. It's been difficult for me to some degree, because people think, well, we're a young earth podcast, and we're not. It's just that he and I have different perspectives, and we try to share the different perspectives. Like, we'll have unashamedly, we'll have old earth creation people on the podcast, and here's the deal. And then we do get complaints from people. We do get emails from people that say, how can you do that? And then we put we'll have a young earth guest, and we get the same kind of thing. How could you even entertain that? So we are trying to provide a service to the body that recognizes that everybody in this discussion are Christians. And I know that, it's not mainstream. We're not, if you come on the podcast, you're not going to be labeled as, oh, that young earth podcast. We're not ICR. And so I'm trying to maintain the position as in terms of what is important for Christians and what are the views. And like, can I even steel man a young earth or an old earth perspective. So I don't want to criticize either camp without being able to understand it. So my delight has been to learn about both sides. I think it's a fascinating ongoing discussion. We've had Danny Faulkner on the book club before. So I think our podcast, I want to assure Michael, because he's been on before, you're not going to be labeled a young earth creationist for coming on, good heavens. But
what I'm saying is I agree with Ken. And Ken, sometimes you do, if you want to have a civil dialogue, you do have to put aside certain things that you know are ridiculous or you know are true. And I find this in today's world of politics. At times, if I want to have a dialogue with someone who disagrees, there are certain aspects you just can't touch to have the civil dialogue. And so, I agree with you, but I also recognize Daniel's point.
Well, there's also a lack of civility that whatever your view is on that, we're talking about brothers and sisters in Christ who hold a different opinion on it. And the lack of charity that I see in some on both sides, but it stings the most when it comes from somebody who's on the opposite side of me on that topic, and the lack of charity of you're worse than an atheist, James, because you believe this. And I would just like to be able to have what you're promoting is a reasonable dialogue, kind of like we do at the book club. I'm not expecting Ken to start believing in God again all of a sudden. It'd be nice if he did, but that's not the goal. We're trying to have.
I'm not terribly far from it. I'm not closed.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to have the conversation, and I want to be friends with Ken.
These fine-tuning arguments. I mean, other things like there's a lot of mysteries that make me want to go and so I'm not. Don't paint me as a out and out militant atheist. I'm not that. What I'm trying to say to the young earth creationists who want to reach out to those on the other side who are non-believers, I'm saying it for your own good, right? It's if you want to be accepted for and taken seriously, you have to give up young earth creation. You just have to.
So let me also throw out an olive branch a little bit different, changing the subject slightly. I was talking with a student today who is investigating Christianity, and he's asked me, so if you weren't a Christian, what would be your worldview? Would you hold to another religion or whatever? And my answer was, I don't see evidence that any other religion is true. I mean, you can look at the tenets of Mormonism, and they're clearly based on, this, James, they're clearly based on a false history. And you can look at the tenets of Islam, and they're clearly based on false history. So I would be a naturalist. I would think if I wasn't a Christian, I would say the material world is all there is. So, it's not that far from where some of you guys are.
I was a deist for some time, that's me as something like middle ground.
Yeah, you made that good point, Ken, about that's often a halfway place between people moving in either direction. So atheists can sometimes become deists on the way to Christianity, and vice versa. On the way out of Christianity, deism might be a stopping point.
I think if I wasn't a Christian, I would not even be a deist. I think if you're going to believe in God, then Christ has made that God clear. I think that to me is obvious. But if I wasn't a Christian, I think I would be a materialist, basically.
Now that you know us a little bit more, having spent 2 hours with us.
Do you always have guests on for 2 hours or what?
Yes, it's hard to get the repeat guests, but we do that. So
I want to come back for 2 hours.
But could you give us any parting advice for both the Christians and the atheists after you've gotten to know us now?
Not that you guys don't already know. I mean, what a valuable thing to wrestle with what could be true. I mean, you guys know the Christian message. Jesus claimed, and I believe that Jesus' words in John are correct, Bill, that Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life. And I'm passionate about finding truth. When I once in my life, I was trying to figure out what direction I wanted to go professionally. And I read the book, What Color's Your Parachute, which asks, what are your motivations in life? And my motivation really is to understand truth, which is why I read Sean Carroll and, Larry Krauss and Victor Stenger and Richard Dawkins, because I want to know what the truth is and I have to read other people. So this is valuable. And I believe there is real truth out there, objective truth. And I think the only way to determine it is to have this kind of dialogue. And so this is great. I really appreciate what you're doing, James and Brady and Dan and all you guys, and Bill, you guess you started this too with James. This is so valuable, particularly in this world that's so polarized. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving us 2 hours of your life.
Yes.
We are looking forward to next month. We're going to be having John W. Loftus discussing his book, Debating Christianity, focusing on the 2 chapters on suffering and as well as on Is There a God, both involving David Wood. So more on our atheistchristianbookclub.com as well as on our Facebook page and Friends Of page as well. Thank you so much, and we will see you guys next month.
When I retire and write my other book, I'll get back in with you guys and we'll do this again.
Well, this has been a privilege. Thank you so much for visiting us.
My pleasure. Thanks. Have a good evening, you guys. Wherever you are. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike. See you in New Orleans.
Yep.